Prince Caspian, Chapter 4. The Dwarf tells of Prince Caspian. Prince Caspian lived in a great castle in the centre of Narnia with his uncle Myras, the king of Narnia, and his aunt who had red hair and was called Queen Pruna Prisma. His father and mother were dead, and the person whom Caspian loved best was his nurse, and though, because of being a prince, he had wonderful toys which would do almost anything but talk, he liked best the last hour of the day when the toys had all been put back into their cupboards and the nurse would tell him stories. He did not much care for his aunt and uncle, but twice a week his uncle would send for him and they would walk up and down together for half an hour on the terrace at the south side of the castle. One day while they were doing this, the king said to him, "Well, boy, we must soon teach you to ride and use a sword. You know that your aunt and I have no children, so it looks as if you might have to be king when I am gone. How should we like that, eh?" "I don't know, uncle," said Caspian. "Don't know, eh?" said Myras. "Why, I should like to know what more anyone could wish for." "All the same, I do wish," said Caspian. "What do you wish?" asked the king. I wish I could have lived in the old days," said Caspian. He was only a very little boy at the time. Now, up until now, King Myras had been talking in the tiresome way that some grown-ups have, which makes it quite clear they are not interested, really, in what anyone is saying. But he suddenly gave Caspian a sharp look. "Eh? What was that?" he said. "What old days do you mean?" "Oh, don't you know, uncle," said Caspian, "when everything was quite different, when all the animals could talk, and there were nice people who lived in the streams and the trees, naiads and dryads they were called, and there were dwarves, and there were lovely little fauns all in the woods, and they had feet like goats and—" "That's all nonsense for babies," said the king sternly. "Only fit for babies, do you hear? You're getting too old for that sort of stuff. At your age you ought to be thinking of battles and adventures, not fairy tales." "Oh, but there were battles and adventures in those days," said Caspian. "Wonderful adventures. Once there was a white witch, and she made herself queen of the whole country, and she made it so that it was always winter. And then 2 boys and 2 girls came from somewhere, and so they killed the witch, and they made them kings and queens of Narnia, and their names were Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy. And so they reigned for ever so long, and everyone had a lovely time, and it was all because of Aslan." "Who's he?" said Myras. And if Caspian had been very little older, the tone of his uncle's voice would have warned him that it would be wiser to shut up. But he babbled on. "Oh, don't you know?" he said. "Aslan is the great lion who comes from over the sea." "Who has been telling you all this nonsense?" said the king in a voice of thunder. Caspian was frightened and said nothing. "Your Royal Highness," said King Myras, letting go of Caspian's hand, which he had been holding until now, "I insist upon being answered. Look me in the face. Who has been telling you this pack of lies?" "Nurse," faltered Caspian, and burst into tears. "Stop that noise," said his uncle, taking Caspian by the shoulders and giving him a shake. "Stop it, and never let me catch you talking, or thinking either, about all those silly stories again. There were never those kings and queens. How could there be 2 kings at the same time? And there's no such person as Aslan. And there are no such things as lions. And there was never a time when such animals could talk. Do you hear?" "Yes, uncle," sobbed Caspian. "Then let's have no more of it," said the king. Then he called for one of the gentlemen in waiting, who was standing at the far end of the terrace, and in a cold voice he said, "Conduct his Royal Highness to his apartments, and send his Royal Highness's nurse to me, at once." Next day, Caspian found what a terrible thing he had done, for nurse had been sent away without even being allowed to say goodbye to him, and he was told he was to have a tutor. Caspian missed his nurse very much and shed many tears, and because he was so miserable, He thought about the old stories of Narnia far more than before. He dreamed of dwarfs and dryads every night and tried very hard to make the dogs and cats in the castle talk to him. But the dogs only wagged their tails and the cats only purred. Caspian felt sure he would hate the new tutor, but when the new tutor arrived about a week later, he turned out to be the sort of person it is almost impossible not to like. He was the smallest and also the fattest man Caspian had ever seen. He had a long, silvery pointed beard which came down to his waist, and his face, which was brown and covered with wrinkles, looked very wise, very ugly, and very kind. His voice was grave, and his eyes were merry, so that until you got to know him really well, it was hard to know when he was joking and when he was serious. His name was Dr. Cornelius. Of all his lessons with Dr. Cornelius, the one that Caspian liked best was history. Up till now, except for the nurse's stories, he had known nothing about the history of Narnia, and he was very surprised to learn that the royal family were newcomers in the country. "It was your Highness's ancestor, Caspian I, said Dr. Cornelius, "the first who conquered Narnia and made it his kingdom. It was he who brought all your nation into the country. You are not native Narnians at all. You are all Telmarines, that is, you all came from the land of Telmar, far beyond the western mountains. This is why Caspian I is called Caspian the Conqueror." "Please, Doctor," asked Caspian one day, "who lived in Narnia before we came here out of Telmar?" "No men, or very few, lived in Narnia before the Telmarines took it," said Dr. Cornelius. "Then who did my great-grandancestors conquer?" "Whom, not who, your Highness," said Dr. Cornelius. "Perhaps it is time to turn from history to grammar." "Oh, please, not yet," said Caspian. "I mean, wasn't there a battle? Why is he called Caspian the Conqueror if there was nobody here to fight with him?" "I said there were very few men in Narnia," said the doctor, looking at the little boy very strangely through his spectacles. For a moment Caspian was puzzled, and then suddenly his heart gave a leap. "Do you mean," he gasped, "that there were other things? Do you mean it was like in the stories, were that—" "Hush," said Dr. Cornelius, laying his head very close to Caspian's. "Not a word more. Don't you know your nurse was sent away for telling you stories about old Narnia? The king doesn't like it. If he found me telling you secrets, you'd be whipped and I should have my head cut off." "But why?" asked Caspian. "It is high time we turned to grammar now," said Dr. Cornelius in a loud voice. "Will your Royal Highness be pleased to open the Prevalentius Secretus of the 4th page of his grammatical garden of the Arbor Accident Pleasantante Odort Enter Wits?" After all that, it was all nouns and verbs till lunchtime, but I don't think Caspian learned much. He was too excited. He felt sure that Dr. Cornelius would not have said so much unless he meant to tell him more sooner or later. In this he was not disappointed. A few days later, his tutor said, "Tonight I am going to give you a lesson in astronomy. At dead of night, 2 noble planets, Tava and Alambil, will pass within 1 degree of each other. Such a conjunction has not occurred for 200 years, and your Highness will not live to see it again. It will be best if you go to bed a little earlier than usual. When the time of the conjunction draws near, I will come and wake you." This didn't seem to have anything to do with old Narnia, which was what Caspian really wanted to hear about, but getting up in the middle of the night is always interesting, and he was moderately pleased. When he went to bed that night, he thought at first that he would not be able to sleep, but he soon dropped off, and it seemed only a few minutes before he felt someone gently shaking him. He sat up in bed and saw that the room was full of moonlight. Dr. Cornelius, muffled in a hooded robe and holding a small lamp in his hand, stood by the bedside. Caspian remembered at once what they were going to do. He got up and put on some clothes. Although it was a summer night, he felt colder than he had expected, and was quite glad when the doctor wrapped him in a robe like his own and gave him a pair of warm, soft buskins for his feet. A moment later, both muffled so that they could hardly be seen in the dark corridors, and both shod so that they made almost no noise, master and pupil left the room. Caspian followed the doctor through many passages and up several staircases, and at last through a little door in a turret they came out upon the leads. On one side were the battlements, on the other side a steep roof, below them, all shadowy and shimmery, the castle gardens, above them stars and moon. Presently they came to another door, which led to the great central tower of the whole castle. Dr. Cornelius unlocked it and began to climb the dark winding stair of the tower. Caspian was becoming excited. He had never been allowed up this stair before. It was long and steep, but when they came out on the roof of the tower and Caspian had got his breath, he felt that it had been well worth it. Away on his right, he could see rather indistinctly the western mountains. On his left was the gleam of the great river, and everything was so quiet that he could hear the sound of the waterfall at Beaversdown a mile away. There was no difficulty in picking out the two stars they had come to see. They hung rather low in the southern sky, almost as bright as two little moons and very close together. "Are they going to have a collision?" he asked in a very awestruck voice. "Nay, dear prince," said the doctor, and he spoke in a whisper. "The great lords of the upper sky know the steps of their dance too well for that. Look well upon them. Their meeting is fortunate and means some great good for the sad realm of Narnia. Tarva, the Lord of Victory, salutes Alambil, the Lady of Peace, and they are just coming to their nearest." "It's a pity that trees get in the way," said Caspian. "We'd really be able to see better from the west tower, though it is not so high." Dr. Cornelius said nothing for about 2 minutes, but stood with his eyes fixed on Tarva and Alambil. Then he drew a deep breath and turned to Caspian. "There," he said, "you have seen what no man now alive has seen, nor will see again, and you are right. We should have seen it better from the smaller tower. I brought you here for another reason." Caspian looked up at him, but the doctor's hood concealed most of his face. "The virtue of this tower," said Dr. Cornelius, "is that we have 6 empty rooms beneath us, and a long stair, and a door at the bottom of the stair which is locked. We cannot be overheard." "Are you going to tell me what you wouldn't tell me the other day?" said Caspian. "I am," said the doctor. "But remember, you and I must never talk about these things except here, on the very top of the great tower." "No, that's a promise," said Caspian. "But do go on, please." "Listen," said the doctor. "All you have heard about old Narnia is true. It is not the land of men. It is the country of Aslan, the country of walking trees and visible naiads, and fauns and satyrs, of dwarves and giants, of the gods and the centaurs, of the talking beasts. It was against these that the first Caspian fought. It is you Telmarines who silenced the beasts and the trees and the fountains, and who killed and drove away the dwarves and the fauns, and are now trying to cover up even the memory of them. The king does not allow them to be spoken of." "Oh, I do wish we hadn't," said Caspian, "and I am glad it was all true, even if it is all over." "Many of your race wish that in secret," said Dr. Cornelius. "But doctor," said Caspian, "why do you say my race? After all, I suppose you're a Telmarine too." "Am I?" said the doctor. "Well, you're a man anyway," said Caspian. "Am I?" repeated the doctor in a deeper voice, at the same moment throwing back his hood so that Caspian could see his face clearly in the moonlight. All at once Caspian realised the truth, and felt that he ought to have realised it long before. Dr. Cornelius was so small and so fat, and had such a very long beard. 2 thoughts came into his head at the same moment. One was a thought of terror. "He's not a real man, not a man at all. He's a dwarf, and he's brought me up here to kill me." The other was sheer delight. "They're a real dwarf still, and I've seen one at last." "So, you've guessed it in the end," said Dr. Cornelius, "or guessed it nearly right. I am not a pure dwarf. I have human blood in me too, Many dwarfs escaped the great battles and lived on, shaving their beards and wearing high-heeled shoes and pretending to be men. They have mixed with your Telmarines. I am one of those, only half dwarf, and if any of my kindred, the true dwarves, are still alive anywhere in the world, no doubt they would despise me and call me a traitor. But never in all these years have we forgotten our own people, and all the other happy creatures of Narnia, and the long lost days of freedom. I'm sorry, Doctor, said Caspian. It wasn't my fault, you know. I'm not saying these things to blame you, dear Prince, answered the Doctor. You may well ask why I say them at all, but I have two reasons. Firstly, because my old heart has carried these secret memories so long that it aches with them, and I would burst if I did not whisper them to you. But secondly, for this, that when you become king, you may help us. For I know that you also, Telmarine though you are, love the old things. I do, said Caspian, but how can I help? You can be kind to the poor remnants of the dwarf people like myself. You can gather learned magicians and try to find ways of awakening the trees once more. You can search through all the nooks and wild places of the land to see if any fauns or talking beasts or dwarves are perhaps still alive in hiding. Do you think there are any? Asked Caspian eagerly. I don't know, said the Doctor with a deep sigh. Sometimes I'm afraid there can't be. I have been looking for traces of them all my life. Sometimes I have thought I have heard a dwarf drum in the mountains. Sometimes at night in the woods I thought I caught a glimpse of fauns and satyrs dancing way off. But when I came to the place, there was never anything there. I have often despaired, but something always happens to start me hoping again. I don't know. But at least you can try and be king, like the High King Peter of old, and not like your uncle. Then it's true about the kings and queens too, and about the White Witch, said Caspian. Certainly it is true, said Cornelius. Their reign was in the golden age of Narnia, and the land has never forgotten them. Did they live in this castle, Doctor? Nay, my dear man, said the old man. This castle is a thing of yesterday. Your great-great-grandfather built it. But when the two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve were made kings and queens of Narnia by Aslan himself, they lived in the castle of Cair Paravel. No man alive has seen that blessed place, and perhaps even the ruins of it have now vanished. But we would believe it was far from here, down at the mouth of the great river, on the very shores of the sea. Oh, said Caspian with a shudder. Do you mean the Black Woods, where all the ghosts live? Your Highness speaks as you have been taught, said the Doctor, but it is all lies. There are no ghosts there. That is a story invented by the Telmarines. Your kings are in deadly fear of the sea, because they can never quite forget that in all the stories, Aslan comes from over the sea. They don't want to go near it, and they don't want anyone else to go near it. So they have let the great woods grow up to cut their people off from the coast. Because they have quarrelled with the trees, they are afraid of the woods. And because they are afraid of the woods, they imagine that they are full of ghosts. And the kings and great men, hating both the sea and the wood, partly believe these stories and partly encourage them. They feel safer if no one in Narnia dares to go down to the coast and look out to sea, towards Aslan's land, and the morning and the eastern end of the world. There was a deep silence between them for a few minutes. Then Dr. Cornelius said, Come, we have been here long enough. It is time to go down and to bed. Must we, said Caspian. I'd like to go on talking about these things for hours and hours. Someone might begin looking for us if we did that, said Dr. Cornelius. End of chapter 4.